So I'm starting the recording now. So just keep that in mind. If you do have questions, you can put them on the chat or, raise your hand or use the microphone as well. But all those things are going to be recorded, just, giving you guys that heads up as usual. So let's talk about genre. And we're going to kind of talk about how genre in video games works differently than it does in other mediums. And it kind of relates back to what we talked about in week 1 about how interactivity is really what makes video games like a new or separate genre. And so when we're building games and thinking about game design, that's the thing that we always have kind of forefront in our mind. So even though we're talking about setting, we want to also be thinking about interactivity and how the player or the user interacts with the game world. So let's talk about genres, and we'll talk a little bit about history and then get into, current games and a bit of the history of games as well. So talking about video game genres, the idea of genre. So if you haven't, this may have come up in like a literature class or a film studies class or something like that if you've taken anything like that, but you may not have talked about it before, and it's kind of a weird word. But it's basically just a system to classify different types of art or media. And it started out with Greek literature. So, this is probably a sort of like historical narrative that may or may not be completely accurate, but this is kind of the first understanding that we have of genre, is separating different types of writing and performance back when the earliest kind of like extant works that we know of. So, Greek poetry and especially plays and prose writing as well are kind of like the earliest works that we have to study in terms of like, how people create different types of entertainment experiences. And so that's where we get this word genre from. That's just an explanation of why we use the word. But it basically is just the way that we talk about different types of media and what the kind of rules or parameters that fit those different media are. So it's not like an absolute sort of like classification system. It basically just is a shorthand that makes it easier for us to kind of understand what we're talking about and what the basic parameters of what we're talking about. So we'll talk about how genre works for a few different traditional mediums, and then we'll get into it as far as how it works in video games. I think I might need to actually reload this. I think. Uh-oh, I don't think I updated my notes. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Just gonna do this real quick. I always update these before the class, and then sometimes I forget to actually push the updates. Oh no, it says I did. Huh. I'll just run the local version for now, and then I'll debug it later. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I'll figure out what the deal is with those later. And let's just, oops. Okay, sorry about this. Just have to reset something. Okay, now we should be able to go ahead. Okay, so when we're talking about literature and thinking about genre, we basically have 2 forms, prose and poetry. So poetry, has rhyming schemes and usually is shorter, although there are epic poems which can be very long. And then prose doesn't usually rhyme, and usually there's different sort of like length. There can be very long essays or novels or books or whatever. Within those two different categories, we have epic, tragedy, and comedy. Those are kind of like the early Greek genres. And then there's sort of like subgenres, but in literature, things actually tend to fit pretty cleanly into one of those three basic genres. And the sort of parameters of those genres usually determine the plot or what happens, and also like the setting and what type of characters we have. So an epic usually centers around a hero that goes on a journey, and there's usually like an episodic nature to it. So this is kind of similar. A lot of games use epic poems or epic stories as their kind of basis, because it fits into the idea of a game where you're kind of like facing one challenge at a time until you get to like the end. So epics tend to have a bunch of episodes where the hero has different challenges, and they either use strength or their wit or some other thing to overcome these challenges. Tragedy usually ends with the main character dying. So regardless of what the tragedy is, every tragedy should end with the main character dying, usually through some sort of personal fault, is how it works in Greek tragedy, but that tends to be true in film and books as well. And then comedy, historically, it's people get married at the end and everybody's happy. Comedy also has like a bunch of different branches that don't have anything to do with marriage, but that's kind of like the traditional idea if you're talking about like Greek comedy or Shakespeare or something like that. So those are kind of the conventions of the genre. And so if you're writing an epic poem or something like that, you usually will work within those conventions. If you kind of go against those conventions, that's like also often in reference to what the conventions are. There's a lot of subgenres, especially in fiction, which apply to more modern stuff: drama, fables, fantasy, folklore, historical fiction, horror, humor, mystery, mythology, poetry, realism, and science fiction. So we talked a little bit about how all those things work last week when we were talking about game worlds. When it comes to genre, those things usually are crossed with one of our main genres, whether it's epic, tragedy, or comedy. In nonfiction, those rules don't really apply because it's usually based on real life. And so you can have nonfiction that is tragic or comedic, but usually it's supposed to be based on what really happened. So that kind of goes against the idea of creating that narrative. So usually we start with literary genres based on the style of writing, and then based on the narrative or the plot elements. So those are the two main parts that determine the genre, if it's poetry or prose, and then like what happens. So it's mostly based around the plot. There's also like historical, period pieces and stuff like that. So let's kind of bookmark that. When it comes to literature, poetry, and prose, genre really has to do with style and narrative. In film, genre is much more related to the setting. So the main film genres that we have are action, adventure, comedy, crime or gangster films, drama, epics, historical, horror, musicals, dance, science fiction, war, and westerns. And again, there's a lot of crossover in all of the different mediums, but in film, things tend to be related to the setting because we're looking at stuff that was filmed in real life, for the most part, on the screen. And so the setting really has a lot to do with how we interpret the film, especially when it comes to things like westerns, war films, gangster films. Like these sort of like more film sort of basic genres have a lot to do with setting. This is based on this kind of like film genre article here that goes into a little bit more detail about what these different genres encapsulate. But it has a lot to do with kind of setting rather than necessarily narrative or style. A lot of film genres tend to kind of combine different parts, like different aspects of the genre into one thing. There's also like the auteur system in film, which is like we refer to like the Hitchcock style, or we have modern auteur filmmakers like maybe like Christopher Nolan might be a good example of somebody who's made a lot of different movies in different genres, but they all have the kind of like Christopher Nolan narrative tropes and things like that. So that's another way that we categorize film that's a little bit different from other mediums. Art is very different as well because we tend to categorize based on like the actual physical medium, like whether it's paint or pencil or sculpture, things like that. But we also categorize it by historical movements. And that's a little bit different. That happens a bit in literature, but it's very specific to art. So the mediums that we have in art are drawing, painting, printmaking, sculpture, collage, textile, photography, film, video, performance, and multimedia. And obviously there's a lot of intermedia or mixed media things that combine multiple ones. But art periods are what we really tend to talk about when we talk about art genres. So, the Renaissance genres, history painting, so like painting scenes from history or mythology, portrait, mostly drawing or painting portraits of like rich people or kings or things like that. Genre paintings, like it has the name genre, which is a bit confusing, but those are everyday life scenes, so like still lives and stuff like that. Landscape, which is what it sounds like, and then of course animal drawings and still life. So these are kind of the different things that we think about with genre as far as art. And Renaissance genre is kind of like where we get a lot of those ideas from. And then there's more detail if you look at art periods, like going beyond Renaissance. You can see neoclassicism, romanticism, modern art, and that kind of brings us up to contemporary art, which is today. And there's all these like little mini kind of genres within those, but they're much more kind of like conceptual than we have in the other mediums. So let's finally get to video games. And what we'll see with video game genre is that there is some relationship to the other mediums in terms of like literature using narrative and style, film using setting, and auteur system, or like the director or creator as a genre, and then art using historical periods and different mediums. Video games have like elements of all of that, but the main thing that we talk about when we're talking about video games is actually how do we interact with the game? Like, what is the system of interaction based on? That usually forms the main genre of a video game. So the basic genres for video games are action, adventure, role-playing, simulation, strategy, casual, and MMO. And we'll go through a few examples of all of these. You guys are probably already thinking about games that you've played that fall into these different genres. So we'll take a look at a few examples. Any questions on the classical or pre-video game genres before we continue? All right, so let's take a look at the different types of video game genres. And so here's a quote from the reading from last week, the designer notebook on genre by Ernest Adams. And he says, video game genres are determined by gameplay, what challenges face the player, and what actions he takes to overcome those challenges. So we clearly have sports games, shooter games, racing games, and so on. So this is like kind of in reference to thinking about other types of genres. So we're really thinking about the player and the gameplay before we're thinking about necessarily the setting or historical period or other things like that, even though those do play into different types of genres. So action games, the first genre, these are typically, simple arcade games are going to be fully action. Most games involve some component of action, but the games that are like purely action games are like early, very simple arcade games. And action basically just means like some timed event that involves hand-eye coordination. So timing and hand-eye coordination, real-time gameplay. So any game that, if you have to do something at a specific time, or you have to be fast, or you have to react to things, that's going to involve action. Destroying enemies without dying is a typical trope of an action game. Pong is kind of like an early example of just like, this is purely action. There's no narrative, there's no setting or other things to think about. It's literally just, moving the paddle up and down in order to react to the bouncing ball. So Pong is a really good example. Any like early Atari game, like Space Invaders or other games like that, are good examples of action. Yeah, John.
Would that be considered like a sports game as well? Like an action slash sports game?
Yeah, yeah. Sports also falls into like simulation. So there is always a lot of crossover with genres, especially in video games. Action is just kind of like the hand-eye coordination component of things. So almost all games involve some component of action, except for like like any like turn-based games. I guess you have as much time as you want to decide what you're going to do, so that doesn't really fall under action. But most games, there's like some timing component to it.
Now because like when I think of action, I think of more like fighting, something like that,
Yeah,
action adventure.
yeah. Fighting games are a good, more modern example of action games where you're kind of like moving back and forth and doing combinations and stuff like that. That's like pure action. So that's a good example. Thanks. So let's keep going. Pac-Man is another good example of an action game. This is Miss Pac-Man, and you can see the controller. That's you, I guess you can't see the whole thing, but that's kind of the emphasis here, is that there's this like real-time connection with the game system. So some subgenres for action, platformers, that's usually, that can be 2D or 3D, but you're jumping on different platforms. That's something that we'll be doing. Shooters, first and third person, where you're kind of like shooting projectiles at different enemies or actors on the screen. Racing, so, this is also falls under simulation, but driving a car or a plane or whatever. Fighting games, as John mentioned. Mario is another, kind of good example of a action game. It's a platformer, so it's a lot of timing, getting your jumps right. That's kind of the challenge built into the game. Adventure games, have a different mechanic, and there's a lot of games that combine action and adventure. So adventure games, the kind of genre starts with like early text-based games where you're interacting with like a console or some kind of interactive fiction. Usually there's more slow gameplay. The challenges can be puzzles or exploration or discovering a story. It can be turn-based, so one player makes an action and the next player makes an action. This also comes from card games like Magic the Gathering or other things like that. Rogue is a good example of an adventure game. And I'll go into actually some more detail about Rogue because it's a really interesting game from a genre perspective in a bit. So action adventure combines real-time play with story and puzzle elements. It's a very typical game type. So then role-playing games. So this originates from Dungeons and Dragons, a game where players collaborate on a sort of like fictional world and the narrative of their different characters. Players control a character or a group of characters. Their role playing focuses on gaining experience or like different metrics that you kind of like build throughout the game. You guys have talked a lot about like skill trees. That's kind of a role playing component of like making choices about which skills to focus on or not. And usually there's full storylines. So there's like a lot of characters. There's a whole complex narrative, which is maybe more similar to like a film or a novel or something like that. Final Fantasy is the classic role-playing game example, where you have a character and you kind of have this long narrative that you go through and explore a lot of different things, and you also kind of collect different items and build up different metrics as well. So simulation, we've touched a little bit on replicating aspects of a real-world experience. This is like very specific to video games. Obviously, this doesn't really happen in other genres. Real-time and turn-based games are the kind of the two different types of simulation games. Simulation games apply real-world rules, so we try to recreate either the physics or the strategy or other components of something that happens in the real world. Flight Simulator is kind of like a really basic example of this, where it's actually used to like train pilots to understand the physics of an airplane. Simulation styles, so vehicle like racing or flight sims. Process construction and management, so like building civilization, strategy, business, like Roller Coaster Tycoon is a good example of that. Sports simulation, so soccer or basketball or whatever. Then we have the strategy genre, which again, there's a lot of crossover, but this is its own area, based on classic games like Risk, where you kind of have to build up your army and make strategic decisions throughout the game. Resource management is an aspect of strategy games, so that might play into an action adventure game as well, but typically it falls under the strategy genre. Decisions and goals, again, like strategizing. So Warcraft, the early Warcraft games are a good example of strategy games where you're managing different resources, characters, and you're kind of like fighting wars against other factions or other groups. So that's a good example of strategy. And again, we see a lot of examples of these genres being combined. And then MMO is also something that's really specific to video games, where it's cooperative, where lots of players are playing together. There's a lot of different, this has become a very popular style of game that's enabled by the internet and networks. You can play by yourself or in teams. There's a social element to playing the game that is part of the genre. And this combines with a lot of different other genres. You can't just have an MMO. It has to be kind of like an MMO along with something else. So it could be first-person shooter, a sports game, a strategy game, or some combination of those. Dota 2 is a really good example of an MMO. Combines other like strategy and other genres.
Wait, you said
Casual game.
Dota 2 is an MMO?
Yeah, is it not?
It's not. It's a MOBA. What's considered like an MMO would be like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy 14, Elder Scrolls Online.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, so what makes how is Dota different from those?
What makes it different from that is like it's not a lot of people on there. Like you need like a whole bunch of people in one screen. That's not really considered an MMO.
Mm. But there are multiple there is like a lot of people playing it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe not the best example. Maybe what's another example of an MMO?
Based like
So
that, yeah,
World of Warcraft.
like all those
Yeah,
games up
well,
there you see, all those, yeah, those are
Yeah,
MMOs. Yeah.
got it.
And
So
that's just
Dota
considered
2, I
as a
guess, is not
MOBA.
an MMO because
Yeah,
No, it's a
they're
MOBA.
not in the same world at
yeah.
the same time.
No.
Sort of like it's like the battle arena from the multiplayer.
Okay, so the difference is multiplayer versus massively multiplayer. I think that I should take out the massively multiplayer because they're kind of in the same area. But thanks for pointing that out.
Oh, no, that's different. I mean, you can leave the MMO, but you could just change Dota to something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like Destiny 2, that's kind of like quote unquote considered MMO, or like World of Warcraft or any
or
other
right.
or like the Old Republic.
But what would I think what I want to capture more is just the multiplayer networked component of it. So would you put Dota 2 and another MMO into like a larger umbrella of like multiplayer? Or would you consider those two separate genres with no crossover?
yeah, two separate genres.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll take a note. I'll add that in.
I mean, would you put
All right.
Dota 2 in the same family as like Diablo? Does that count?
No.
Would that count? No? All right.
Mm.
No, what's different with Diablo?
Diablo 2 is it's a loot based type of game, and it's more of dungeon crawler.
Uh, yeah.
Dota is a MOBA like League of Legends.
Yeah, it's a
I think
team-based strategy
Diablo is
game.
more RPG really. You're just leveling and following a story. There's not a massive multiplayer in it.
Okay.
There's multiplayer aspect to it, but it's not really massive multiplayer. But Diablo 4, yeah.
Okay, so there's different versions of the game that have different mechanics.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, let's keep going. So casual games are another genre that tend to be on your phone or like a mobile device or a browser a lot of the time. They tend to be short experiences, and they're not really supposed to be. There's like a challenge to them, but it's not supposed to be necessarily as challenging as other types of games. Um, so they tend to involve puzzles, word games, or board games. Diner Dash is one of the classic examples of a casual game where it's resource management and there's other things that are involved. So there is like challenge to it, there is gameplay to it, but it doesn't require as much sort of like onboarding and as much play through to enjoy as a game that you might spend a lot more time on. So casual games is another genre. And so I mentioned the game Rogue earlier. What I wanted to talk about is how this is a really good example of like how genres sort of like how new genres get created. So a lot of the genres we've talked about, there's usually a game or a series of games or something that we kind of think of as emblematic of those genres. And sometimes games that combine elements in a unique or novel way can forge kind of their own type of genre. So the roguelike genre is games that take on some of the genre conventions that Rogue sort of created. So Rogue was first created in 1980. It was created to be like a very small game that could be distributed across early internet networks, and so it doesn't have like built-in levels because building all the levels and then saving them takes up a lot of memory on the computer, so it makes it harder to distribute. So to create Rogue, basically what they did is created an algorithm that would generate new levels every time you play the game. And that's one of the main components of the roguelike genre. It was inspired by early text-based adventure games and interactive fiction, so it involves a lot of those kind of elements. Things like sort of the mythology and the ideas of Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. But as I mentioned, in order to create an infinite sort of different types of experiences from a very small code base, they developed this random level generation system so that you could play the game over and over and over again, and it would always be different. And creating the game, you don't have to have like all of these levels mapped out. They basically created these parameters that would generate the levels to create a different experience. So there's a lot of games that fall into the roguelike genre because they specifically use this like level generation system. I think Binding of Isaac is one of the games that we've talked about in class that uses a roguelike level system. So there's like an entire movement that was inspired by Rogue. There's communities that are dedicated to creating roguelike games. So this is a link to like a forum, or I think it's a wiki, yeah, that has all of these different resources and essays and different things about roguelikes. And there's roguelike jams and things like that. So just this like one game has created this whole genre of people creating different versions of this type of game. Okay, so thinking about what genre of games we're going to be making in class, there's some components of the game that are going to be kind of built into how we're approaching it as far as using Godot engine and what we'll be building as the game engine. But there's other parts of the genre that you guys will decide on your own that may be different from each other. So the games, for the most part, are going to be 2D. They're probably going to be platform games. You don't necessarily have to do platforms. If you decide you want to do something different and not use platforms and physics and stuff like that, you will be able to do that. But most of the games will be sort of platformer style games. And the setting and other things like that are kind of up to you guys. Yes, Sam.
Sorry,
Do you have a-
Professor. Yeah, what do you mean for the most part it's going to be 2D?
Oh, no, it's going to be 2D entirely. Like the games will be 2D, or at least the art will be 2D.
Oh, okay, no problem. Got it.
Yeah. Where you do have some flexibility is as far as like the game mechanics. So most of the games I think will be platformers, but there will be other aspects of the game that will be that you could elaborate on that will not necessarily use the physics or the platformers. Like if you want to turn off the gravity and just have your player walk around and just explore stuff, that's an option that you can choose. As far as so they will be kind of like action games by default, but there are opportunities for you guys to add in other elements to the game, like the narrative components. If you want to add things like strategy or turn-based action or things like that, those are things that we could figure out how to do throughout the semester. So that's something that you guys should be thinking about. But in terms of the setting and the game world, that's really more up to you guys as far as what you want your vision is and what you want to create for the game. And that will be expressed by the art as well as things that you change about the game mechanics as we go through the semester. Any other questions on the game genre or other things in general? All right, so I'm gonna stop recording. My mouse go.